Hey everybody, this is a lecture for chapter 7, which is on motivational interviewing. First start with just sort of defining and describing what motivational interviewing is, and of course touch on some of these basic tenets as your PowerPoint says. First and foremost, motivational interviewing is not a theory. It is a set of techniques and an overall way of sort of being with your client, an attitude, if you will, that is designed to bring out or elicit the client's change process. That's our goal, right? As counselors, it's to work with clients to elicit change in feelings, change in attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, ideas about themselves, knowledge, skills. But the focus is predominantly on change. And so motivational interviewing is designed to enhance that process. This change process. It is collaborative. It is a way of communicating or speaking with or asking questions of your client. And again, the whole point is to elicit change. You see here at the bottom, motivational interviewing is a trans-theoretical approach to change process. So if you're into trans-theoretical analysis, this sort of comes from that approach. Motivational interviewing is fluid and flexible. You work with the client's ambivalence about how to change, about the process of changing. And the goal is to just sort of sit with them until the client can work through that ambivalence or that resistance, and you're going to hear that word resistance a lot, but to essentially work through that ambivalence to establish goals and objectives that can foster change. Your goal is to support autonomy. Your goal is to just be there with empathy, regardless of where they are in this change process. And we're going to talk about stages of change in just a second. But your goal is essentially just to sit with them and be with them regardless of their view of how and when this change needs to happen. So, like I mentioned, there are stages of change. And if you have not heard of or learned about stages of change yet, you will hear and see this a lot. We use this in counseling a lot to describe just the process of changing, the process of making alterations or adjustments to behaviors and belief systems, hopefully for the positive. And so the first stage is pre-contemplation. This is the earliest stage. And this is when an individual hasn't even considered the idea of changing. They don't even see why they need to change. They're in denial. Let's just use the example as we go through these stages of change of addiction, because that's what we're talking about in this chapter, or excuse me, in this course. So this is, I don't have a problem. Everyone else has a problem. I don't have an issue. There's no need to change. Then we move into contemplation. Contemplation is when an individual may be open to the idea that their behavior is causing problems. Maybe even considering the idea of change, but really not ready to do so. Characterized by marked ambivalence about change. So this would be, all right, yeah, I could see where my drinking may have caused a few problems, but it's nothing that I can't overcome. It's not a big deal. I don't really need to change, but there's that glimmer of thought that problems do exist. Then we move into preparation. In preparation stage, the client realizes that there are enough negative consequences associated with their behaviors or their way of thinking that warrant at least a minimal change. So the client, of course, at this stage, the client, again, of course, with the support of the counselor, may begin to develop a very small plan to change. So this is preparation stage. So just to recap, pre-contemplation, that's complete denial. There's no problem. Contemplation, okay, maybe there is, but I'm not ready to change. Preparation, I'm recognizing some negative consequences and I'm going to start working on a plan to change. I don't really know how. I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit worried about following through with all of this, but at least I can start talking about changing, again, using addiction, changing maybe my drinking patterns. Action stage is when the plan is implemented. Okay, so we've gone through pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, and now we're going to implement this plan. This stage can be incredibly overwhelming for your client. And so this is when you as a counselor are going to focus on their strengths and their abilities. You're going to pull in all of the bits about them that can support their plan that they have created, of course, with your support, to make the modifications to their behaviors that they recognize are problematic. I don't know if you guys are picking up on this yet, but this is a lot of client-centered thinking. It's their ideas, their ways, their place in the change process. This isn't ours. You are sitting with them until they get to these different stages. And then finally, maintenance stage. This is when the change has happened and action plan is complete. Changes happen and the action plan is complete. And so in the maintenance stage, as a counselor, your role is to support the plan, to support their ideas of maintaining and sustaining their behaviors that they've changed. All right. So sort of moving on and considering these stages of change, you can see how incredibly complicated this can be, especially when we talk about substance use disorders. Just think minimally the complexity between the physiological and psychological changes. Let's just look at the physiological changes. So an individual may want to change, but the idea of withdrawal may be too much, that they don't want to go through the physical symptoms of changing. So their body may fight against this desire to change. Their psyche, their emotions may fight against this desire to change. So there's this interplay between, when we talk about change, you have to consider the interplay between the physiological and the psychological issues that are going to be involved in this change process. That is super important. So one of the things that's key to motivational interviewing is this concept of resistance. And this is when the client at all of those different stages of change are going to experience bucking the idea to change. This is this resistance. And again, this happens at varying times throughout the change cycle. There is this overwhelming desire to maintain the status quo. We human beings don't do change very well in general. And so we want homeostasis, even if homeostasis isn't healthy. We want to maintain the status quo. So when we talk about resistance from a motivational interviewing standpoint, as you can see here on the slide, this quick little description that's from your text, an interpersonal exchange whereby a client appears to be working against the change while a counselor may seem to be arguing for it. So essentially, when a client, according to motivational interviewing, when a client is resisting this change process, it's not necessarily related to their motivation. It's related to the struggle that may be happening between you, the counselor, and the client. So instead of arguing for this change process, instead of saying, yes, but look at all these negatives. Yes, but you have this negative consequence and this negative consequence. Motivational interviewing suggests rolling with resistance, and that's sort of a quote, rolls with resistance, because that's sort of the way that motivational interviewing suggests addressing resistance. You just say, look, I get it. This, you're not ready to change, or you don't think that there's a problem, and that's okay. And you're here with them. So you sit with them. You sit with them at whatever stage that they are in, as opposed to arguing that they need to change. Motivational interviewing suggests that when you start arguing that they need to change, it's your idea, your perception, and it's your goal, not theirs. So let's look at the primary principles. Express empathy, develop discrepancy, roll with resistance, and support self-efficacy. Empathy. This is, you guys should know empathy at this point. It's when you understand your client's point of view, you normalize that level of ambivalence, and you're going to convey this unconditional acceptance. You are there with them. Moving on to developing discrepancies. So that's when this is directive. This is when you're actively listening to your client, and you can reflect back to them when there is a incongruent thought or statement that they have maybe made. So some cognitive dissonance here. The change process begins when the client is able to see these discrepancies. So an example of this would be denying the fact that there are any negative consequences related to their use, and then maybe later on in their session with you or their discussion with you, pointing out a negative consequence and identifying as the negative consequence. So you as the counselor would say, I'm hearing that, very early on in our session, you mentioned that there are absolutely no negative consequences, but I just heard you say that it's preventing you from seeing your daughter. And that sounds like something that's kind of bothering you. So that's just an idea of maybe what this, of developing a discrepancy would look like, or pointing out that incongruence. Rolling with resistance, like we talked about. And this is you not arguing for change or the change process. You just sit with them. An example I like to use of this is with mandated clients. So oftentimes mandated clients don't want to be around, don't want to be in counseling, don't want to be there. And one of the first things that I always like to say to them, or when I'm feeling some resistance, is, look, I get you don't want to be here. I get that you're here talking with me because you have to, but you have to be here. So what can we talk about? So I'm not saying we need to talk about your use. I'm saying, what do you want to talk about? And I will literally sit with them and talk about whatever it is that they want to talk about for however many sessions it takes to get them to a point where they're comfortable enough to start talking about some of these things that might elicit this change, or get them, or they may come to the idea that change needs to happen. And that might not be the case. They might not get to the point where change needs to happen, and that's okay. And then self-efficacy. A huge principle here and a basic tenet is the idea that they have autonomy. And so it's not my choice or my place or my perspective to tell them they need to change and why. And so from motivational interviewing standpoint, you support their autonomy. You support their personal choice to change and how to change. So an example of this would be if you work in a facility or you believe strongly that abstinence is the only way to addiction treatment, and your client says, I'm interested in harm reduction or moderation approaches, from a motivational interviewing standpoint, and quite frankly, from depending upon the level of severity, it's your job to sit with them and say, okay, let's look at how we can implement some some harm reduction or moderation approaches. It's not your change. It's their change. It's their negative consequences. And of course, just the idea that you're sitting with them and you believe in their ability to change when, of course, they bring it up and they get to that place. Some techniques: asking open-ended questions, using reflective listening, affirming them, summarizing and eliciting that talk change. Let's see. I want you to look at this. What is dissonance, consonance, resistance? One thing is arguing. You don't want to argue with your clients, or interrupting them, or negating, or ignoring. This is a battle. We don't want to get into battles with our clients, whether you're utilizing motivational change or not. Keep reading on in your text. Here's some advantages. Disadvantages: doesn't necessarily work all that well or have the same effectiveness with clients with severe mental illness. And it may not be as sufficient at reaching all of your clients' goals, particularly if you only have a short number of sessions with your client. This obviously could take a long time following your client's progression of change, and so it may not be as speedy as other as other forms of treatment.